Thank you, Martin, for inviting me to chat on this live stream today. I am going to talk about what I have glibly called podcasting. Yeah. The only thing I have to add decor is this ukulele, which if things go really badly, I might start playing. Podcasting and scholarship, two okay tastes that taste okay together, which once upon a time was a slide in a talk that I was giving that said scholarship and podcasting, two great tastes that taste great together. But I don't feel comfortable calling either podcasting or scholarship great, because I have kind of some ambivalence about both of these things. But I do think that they complement one another quite well. So I'm going to start, just in case anybody is tuning in or watching this later who doesn't know my background as a podcaster. I'm going to talk a little bit about where I'm coming from in terms of podcasting and scholarship. So I am predominantly an academic. That's my day job and also my evening job and also my weekend job sometimes. And I started off as an English literature scholar. I did my PhD in Canadian literature at the University of Guelph. And then when I was at the University of Alberta doing a postdoc on periodical history and Canadian prairie publishing, which is very exciting, I assure you. Didn't I make it sound fun by making a noise at the beginning? Yeah. Anyway, I was chatting with my friend Marcel one day about how much both of us missed reading for pleasure, because we had both found that doing higher education in literature really sucked the pleasure out of reading, because reading becomes your day and evening and weekend job. That's kind of all you do, and you don't do it for fun anymore. And we talked about the idea of maybe doing a Harry Potter, like, two-person book club, and the two of us would just read the books together. And then it was Marcel's idea that we should record it as a podcast. Marcel had a little bit of background in community theater, and she was interested in trying her hand at podcasting, seeing if she could get comfortable with the technology. She hadn't done a ton of audio production before. So we sat down one evening with a couple of bottles of wine and the first Harry Potter book, and I think some chips that we ate on mic because we were very good at what we were doing, and Marcel's little Zoom H4 and a single microphone that we just handed back and forth to one another as we talked, which turned out to be actually really pivotal for how we made that podcast, because it meant we couldn't constantly interrupt each other, by which I mean I couldn't constantly interrupt Marcel. But that night was born Witch Please, which was our project in rereading Harry Potter together and talking about it as we went. And because Marcel was interested in thinking through podcasting as a form, she argued that we should have some segments, make some deliberate decisions about structure, make some decisions about music and sound up front, so that we could experiment with what it meant to create a structured conversation. And in that sense, I really attribute to Marcel any of the success Witch Please had, because I absolutely would have just turned on a microphone and started talking a lot like this, actually. But Marcel wanted there to be structure, and she wanted there to be sense, and she wanted there to be segments. And so the two of us, a couple of English PhDs, were like, well, what are some logical segments? Well, let's talk about narrative perspective, and let's talk about representations of gender. And without really thinking that much about it, we just structured the conversation around our kind of research interests, the way that we think and talk about books. And then we made that podcast and we put it out into the world. And the first time somebody said to us, hey, the podcast that you're making is a scholarly podcast, was a real revelation, which is funny to me in retrospect, because listening back, it is undeniably two scholars talking in a scholarly fashion about some books, which is scholarship, I suppose. Anyway, the process of making Witch Please taught me a lot, predominantly about the kinds of existing audiences out there for scholarly podcasting, by which I mean entertaining podcasts that are still rooted in a scholarly perspective on the thing that they're discussing. And they really made me second guess a lot of assumptions, either that I derived at myself or that I had gathered from other people, about the lack of interest in audiences particularly for humanities scholarship. I knew that there was a whole field of people doing knowledge translation and knowledge mobilization in the sciences. And in fact, lots of examples already of podcasts that do a really good job of that kind of knowledge translation. I mean, Radiolab is all about the pleasures of really good scientific communication and the way you can turn science into storytelling. But the general impression I had gotten as a humanities scholar is that our research and our knowledge was not interesting to people outside of our very, very narrow fields. And Making Which Please demonstrated to me that that was decisively incorrect, that perhaps one of the reasons why humanities scholarship fails to get a wider audience is that we often don't make any particular effort to reach people outside of our really specific niches. And so when I started the job that I currently have at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, oh yeah, there's a hedge trimmer going outside too, because I want to create a rich sonic landscape for you all. So when I started my job at Simon Fraser University, I work in a publishing department now, and one of the main interests of my colleagues is non-traditional scholarship, open access scholarship, scholarly communication in general, the whole question of how it is that we can make our knowledge, and by our knowledge, I mean the kinds of research knowledge that are developed at universities. And, dang, I have to turn up the background, and make that more accessible, more interesting, not just at the basic level of open access publishing where scholarship isn't paywalled, but also at the level of making stuff accessible at the level of language, accessible at the level of discoverability, so making podcasts instead of writing journal articles because people already listen to podcasts and know where to find them. Whereas most people who aren't academics aren't hanging out on JSTOR very often. I say most, not all. So that has led me into what has become my current primary field of research. This is sort of the big thing that I do now, is I make and talk about scholarly podcasting. And that led me into the prototype project that I am just wrapping up right now with Wilfrid Laurier University Library, working on the possibility of peer reviewing podcasts. Hello, Jacob. I don't know you, but welcome. There's a hedge trimmer in the background, but apparently nobody can hear it but me. That's fine. So the prototype project that I started with Wilfrid Laurier University Library was about whether or not we could not only imagine podcasts as a really effective way to translate scholarly knowledge, but in fact think about treating podcasts as themselves the primary form of scholarly publishing. So whether or not we could peer review them. So this was a departure, I think, from what people have done so far with the overlap of scholarship and podcasting. And for a lot of reasons, I think they fit together really well. And you can tell that the scholarly fits into podcasting because of how many podcasts have an underlying scholarly or pedagogical function to them, or find themselves engaging with that anyway. I mean, I already mentioned Radiolab. I think you can look to a lot of popular history podcasts. My personal favorite is The Secret History of Canada, which is a really, really wonderful, well-researched history podcast that is not made by scholars, but that is absolutely engaging with historical research and with a kind of scholarly storytelling. But even in podcasts where you wouldn't expect to find it, you stumble upon the use of scholarship. A moment that really stood out for me was listening to an episode of Buffering the Vampire Slayer, where they were trying to grapple, the hosts were trying to grapple with the representation of race in Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is what the podcast is about. And feeling themselves perhaps ill-equipped to have the kinds of nuanced conversations about racial representation they might have wanted to have, they found a scholarly edited collection of essays about race in Buffy and read extensively from the introduction to it. And it was an incredible moment for me as an academic listening to this podcast and being like, oh, look at that. When people find themselves in need of insight on a topic, they find scholarship about it. And podcasting, I think, lends itself to those kinds of moments because it is often engaged in deep dives into niche topics, the development of a kind of amateur expertise, like a non-institutionalized expertise, but nonetheless a kind of expertise embodied by the hosts, and a kind of built trust between host and listener, where over time listeners really come to invest a lot in their hosts, as if not necessarily knowing everything about a particular topic, certainly being ready to look things up and find things out. And that's where I increasingly find that podcasts where I wouldn't expect it end up turning to the scholarly. So all of this suggests to me that there is some fruitful overlap between these different worlds, between podcasting and scholarship, which, as I was saying, led to the question of whether or not we could embrace podcasts not just as mobilizing scholarship or citing from scholarship or re-disseminating or translating scholarship, but as actually doing it in real time. So the origin of this collaboration came, as so many things do, from a conversation at a conference, from the before times when we flew to conferences and talked to each other in person, which was exciting. And I was having a conversation with Siobhan McMenemy, who is the supervising editor. I could never remember Siobhan's actual title, and I always accidentally demote her. Managing editor, supervising editor, so like the next person down from the person who runs the press, but I don't remember what her title is. Anyway, Siobhan McMenemy, who is at Wilfrid Laurier University Library, and who is really, really interested in the question of how university libraries, Wilfrid Laurier University Press. That's also an important distinction. I both demoted her and switched her field. Sorry, Siobhan. So she's really interested in the question of how university presses can collaborate with scholars to try to make scholarship more accessible, and to make sure that it is more sort of widely shared. And so she was interested in whether or not podcasting could be one of the ways through that, not the exclusive way. She's interested also in different forms of scholarly writing, different genres of books. They're involved in a project that is looking at creating academic audiobooks. So finding some sort of appropriate monographs and recording them as audiobooks, which I think is a really exciting innovation. But she was also interested in what we could do with podcasts. So we partnered up together. We got some funding from SSHRC, which is the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the big government research funder here in Canada. And we started making a podcast together. And the podcast that we started making is the primary podcast that I still make today. It's called Secret Feminist Agenda. It is a podcast about feminism and about the relationship between feminist theory and feminist praxis. A friend of mine once joked when I invited her onto it that she was going to be the only guest on the podcast who had ever not used the word praxis. But then she made that joke out loud, and so she had used the word praxis, and so the last laugh was on her. So it is about feminism and about how we enact it in our daily lives. SSHRC is a fantastic acronym. How dare you? And so half the episodes of the podcast, I interview interesting feminists about the work they do. Sometimes those feminists are scholars and they are talking about the scholarship that they do. A lot of the time they are not. They are activists or artists or people working in other kinds of sectors. It's really exciting for me to get to talk to people who are doing feminist work outside of the university so that we can sort of work across those gaps in different ways. And on the intervening episodes, what I call mini-sodes, I talk about a feminist topic of my choice. And those vary really, really widely from, say, I made an episode about Jurassic Park and why I thought Jurassic Park was a really important and pivotal feminist film. And if you would like to hear that argument, you have to listen to the episode, but it is a watertight argument because Jurassic Park is absolutely about the rise of a matriarchy that overcomes a sort of masculinist scientific futurism. The dinosaurs represent feminism and they eat the lawyer. Anyway, other episodes, I talk about video games or about grappling with having relationships with women of color when you were a white woman, or like the topics are basically whatever I feel like talking about on that particular episode. And then Siobhan and I guess, had to figure out how to peer review that podcast. And it was a challenge for a lot of reasons, including that the original plan had been for Siobhan and I to make maybe 5 or 6 episodes of a short run podcast that she would listen to first, and then that would get sent out to peer reviewers, and that would go through the whole sort of traditional arc of scholarly publishing. And then after, a year and a half, because scholarly publishing takes a really long time, we would decide that it was done and we would publish it on the press website. But I was really committed to the idea of making a podcast that was a podcast first and scholarship second. And what I mean by that is that podcasts have their own publishing logic. They have their own audience relationship logic. They even have their own peer logic. And so does the world of scholarly publishing. So podcasts, for example, they're sort of traditional forms of discoverability or through podcast apps. The traditional forms of peer evaluation and feedback is through Apple Podcast review, blog comments, social media response, maybe the occasional email. The traditional forms of sort of circulation are social media, sharing on other podcasts. So there's this entire sort of ecosystem of publishing and a whole logic to how podcasts work. And then there's the whole ecosystem and logic of scholarly publishing and how it works. And the fact that the primary form of discoverability is scholarly search engines and citations in other books on similar topics, or possibly the book fairs at your big scholarly conference. And there are ways that you can move both podcasts and scholarship into other publishing ecosystems, but that takes work. And so what I really wanted to do was start in the world of podcasts and see how we could sort of move the podcast into the world of scholarship rather than vice versa. And that presented a number of really interesting challenges and a number of really interesting opportunities. The primary challenge that it posed is that I was making the podcast on a weekly basis, and it is fundamentally impossible to peer review something that is coming out weekly because peer review is a slow process. So instead, we decided that we would peer review the podcast after the fact, season by season. And that because the podcast is a fundamentally open medium, that we would also make the peer review open. So all of the peer review for the first 3 seasons of Secret Feminist Agenda are up and open on the Wilfrid Laurier University Press website, and you can read what people have to say about it. The other sort of real challenge is then that because the peer review is happening after the fact, I'm not going to go back and edit episodes that have already been out, that have already been responded to. And so the peer review could only ever inform the next season of the podcast that I was making, which I do think in some ways ended up working out really well and produced this effect where people could see both what I made without feedback, the feedback that I got, and then how I changed the thing that I was making as a result, which produces a kind of nice transparency around scholarly production and peer review and how those things work, but certainly meant that I was putting things out into the world prior to having an opportunity for those things to be peer reviewed, which meant if I made mistakes, those mistakes were mine alone. And I absolutely did make mistakes. And that points for me to the really great part of doing scholarship in this really open public medium, where I do have this built-in audience, and that built-in audience is my listeners. And my listeners, because of the conventions of podcasting, feel quite comfortable letting me know if I have messed up on something. So if I misrepresent something, miss an important topic, use language that troubles people, fail to deal with a topic with the kind of nuance or sensitivity that my listeners would like, they tell me. And they tell me directly and quickly and openly in a way that would be actually very difficult for me to get in most other venues about my scholarly work. Maybe at a conference, if I'm lucky and people show up to my panel and actually listen and actually engage. But for the most part, you're sitting around waiting to like see if somebody writes an article about your article 5 years later that points out the problems with your article. And that's not exactly a timely form of feedback. Of course, I have students in the classroom, but all of the built-in hierarchies of the classroom mean that it's incredibly difficult to get real-time feedback from students about ways in which you are messing up. Even if you work really hard to sort of create that dynamic and that possibility, at best you're going to get them in teaching evaluations at the end of the semester, and then can, sort of iterate differently. But having that built-in audience has really informed how I think about my scholarship, including really valuing the kinds of open and ready feedback that I get. So the other thing that I wanted to make sure to chat about today, I on Instagram a little while ago asked people if they had particular things that they would like me to tackle today. And the other thing people asked about is podcasts and teaching. Generally, podcasts and teaching are not really my shtick, and that's not because I don't think podcasts and teaching go well together. It's because in the university, we're really comfortable for the most part with using podcasts for teaching. In fact, there's a long and proud history of using podcasts for teaching. One of the early, most widespread investments in podcasting was, I believe, Duke University, where they essentially did a pedagogical experiment where they gave out iPods to all of the students and encouraged professors to record their lectures as MP3s and make them available for students to listen on their off time. And there's been ample research into the success of using podcasts to supplement teaching. So putting lectures on podcasts so that students can listen on their own time at their own pace has proven to be quite effective. You can also, of course, use podcasting as an assignment, which I have done in a lot of my classes. I have students make podcasts instead of writing essays, which is really great as an assignment model. And of course, there are lots and lots of institutional podcasts, so lots of examples of universities or different departments within the university using podcasts to share and mobilize the different kinds of work that are happening, not necessarily sort of doing research out loud, but certainly promoting the existing research of scholars in a department, for example. And there had been significantly less interest and attention paid to podcasting as scholarship itself, podcasting as research, which is sort of my investment. I was about to say where I've planted my flag, but that's an awfully colonialist turn of phrase, so maybe I shouldn't. However, with the current global pandemic and the fact that many of us who work in universities are having to grapple with teaching online or teaching via distance options in a way that we have not before, a lot of people are really interested in podcasts and how podcasts can be used for pedagogy. And as I have been thinking about the challenges of teaching online, and particularly the challenges of forming community, I have been thinking about what I have learned from podcasting about the possibilities of what you might call digital intimacies. So in this regard, I would say Secret Feminist Agenda is less my go-to example than Witch Please is, for a variety of reasons, including that Witch Please found a wider listenership that involved more people outside of the university. And that's that Harry Potter pull. You make something about Harry Potter, you're going to automatically get a bunch of Harry Potter fans. but also because I think Witch Please had a more obviously pedagogical function than Secret Feminist Agenda does. And Secret Feminist Agenda really is more about having conversations about the kinds of work people are doing, whereas Witch Please was more about trying to explain different ways of reading and different ways of thinking about text, using Harry Potter as the kind of model. And in fact, Marcel and I right now are involved in thinking through the possibility of a reboot of Witch Please. And we are thinking explicitly about that question of how can we imagine the podcast as teaching a bunch of ways of reading and thinking critically, in which Harry Potter is our example, our sort of go-to textual evidence. And so as people have been thinking about how to do their teaching online, I have been thinking, well, what does podcasting have to contribute to this conversation? And I think there's a number of really interesting ways of thinking about podcasting as a great fit for teaching online, depending on what you're teaching, as I learned from a Twitter conversation. So podcasting is a beautiful fit for teaching any kinds of language-intensive disciplines, disciplines that often involve sort of lectures or explanations of things, that involve demonstrating close readings, having to give historical background, having to give context. I think podcasting would be beautiful for moving a literature classroom online, or for moving a history classroom online, or for moving a philosophy classroom online. I have had colleagues point out to me that it's maybe less ideal a fit for, say, design or art history, or, as it turns out, several of the sciences. Because from what I understand, sciences and math, from what I understand, it is quite hard to teach math over a podcast. People really rely on being able to do the math on like a screen or surface. I'm holding a pen so you can see how math works. So I don't want to suggest that this is a beautiful sort of one size fits all. This is the medium that is going to solve everybody's problems when it comes to their desire to communicate, whether that's communicating their research or communicating their teaching to their students. But again, in disciplines where you don't rely so intensely on the visual, podcasting can work really well. And it has some beautiful advantages to it. Those advantages include the fact that it is an extremely low barrier to access medium for students. MP3s are very small files that are really easy to download and stream as compared to video files or video lectures. They can be downloaded and listened to asynchronously, so students don't have to have access to a laptop or be logged in at a particular time. And they're already a medium that lend themselves to a kind of immersive and intensive listening. So most people who listen to podcasts don't listen to podcasts while sitting in front of a laptop staring at a screen, which we have lots of evidence is actually a really crummy way for people to try to learn. That's why we all hate Zoom meetings so much. But that's not how people engage with podcasts. They engage with podcasts by throwing them on their headphones and going and doing something. You go and do the laundry, you go and laundry is all I can think of. You go and make dinner, you go for a walk, you go do your groceries, you complete another task, and you listen at the same time. And that high level of engagement of a single sense alongside the sort of completion of other banal tasks really helps people attend closely or immersively to what's going on in the podcast. It's one of the reasons why podcasting as a medium tends to provoke strong feelings of closeness to the hosts, even if you've never met them. It's why so many of us who are big podcast fans often feel like we are secret friends with the hosts, or would become friends with the hosts if only we had the opportunity. Or maybe spend a lot of our free time texting our real life friends about how we think the hosts' lives are going, because I've definitely done that with a lot of friends about a lot of podcasts. And so when we're talking about what gets lost when we're not in the classroom together, and the kinds of intimacies that are produced in the classroom via the experience of being face to face, it's really hard to think about a digital medium that can reproduce that with any kind of directness, right? Like in any way that you can actually recreate that same feeling of in-person exchange. But instead of trying to perfectly reproduce the experience of the in classroom, why don't we think instead about other forms of digital media that don't have the same kinds of closeness and intimacy, but have a different kind, perhaps an also really legitimate kind? And in that sense, again, podcasting has there's lots of signs that it is a way that people are comfortable taking deep dives into niche topics while also developing a sense of closeness to the hosts. And then the challenge for a teacher in that setting becomes, how do you allow for the reciprocating of that closeness? So how do you make sure that it isn't what Glenn Weldon once referred to as one-sided intimacy? Because that is often the case with podcasts, that intimacy only goes in one direction. So what does it look like to create multi-directional intimacies via podcasting? That's gross. That's a gross academic thing I just said. But that is, I think, a question that you have to ask if you're using podcasts for teaching. And I also think it's a question that maybe you're asking if you are trying to use podcasts for feminist work, as I am, podcasts to build different kinds of community, podcasts to engage audiences, not only in a sort of one directional way. One directional is sounding like a band reference. All of which is to say that there's an important question here around how you encourage responsiveness. And that for me is an opportunity to think about ways of building in the possibilities for response. And again, we can look back to a lot of really great podcasts that already do that in smart ways. So, for example, long-running popular comedy podcasts like Jordan Jesse Go and Stop Podcasting Yourself have a strong sense of listener connection because they have built in a weekly listener response segment where people call in with, in the former example, momentous occasions, and in the latter example, overheards. And in both of those cases, their listeners have this opportunity to share details of their own lives and then to hear those details on the podcast itself in a way that makes them feel like they are part of the world of the podcast, so that that intimacy then feels like it is being reciprocated. It's a great example for a lot of podcasters who are thinking about ways to make their audiences feel like they are part of what's going on in the actual world of the podcast. And it's also a really good example of how we can think about it in a teaching setting. So I think that there's a lot of really interesting potential around the possible use of podcasting as a classroom tool in more remote settings. And I am excited to see people maybe experiment with it rather than defaulting to the sort of built-in video lecture function on whatever their learning management system is. This is a great time for me to pause and take a sip of water. Ready? And also there's a question in the chat, so I'm going to answer it. And if anybody else has questions, I would really love to answer those as well, because that was me talking for 35 minutes, and that feels like plenty. So there's a question from Jacob here. It says, how long did it take you to be comfortable with placing your work out and not being nervous? That's a really good question, because there is this vulnerability built into doing publicly engaged and publicly accessible scholarly work. The traditional forms of scholarly audience making often sort of provide us with like this armor between us and the rest of the world, by which I mean it's hard for your students to give you direct feedback in anything other than class evaluations, which are sort of famously a little bit harsh sometimes, but are often also dismissed by academics. You often get virtually no feedback on a paper or a book once it's published. You're lucky if you get a handful of reviews. The small circulation and the heavy mediation of scholarly communication often means that it doesn't necessarily feel as vulnerable as more fully publicly engaged modes of communication can feel. And so that was a learning curve when Marcel and I started making witch plays, is getting used to what to do with the feedback when we said something and people didn't like it, and to figure out how to hear the critique that we were getting, how to sit with it, how to make our own personal judgment calls about what critique we were going to take seriously and what critique we didn't necessarily want to listen to. And sometimes that was an easy call to make. When somebody listened to an episode and said, hey, I found the way that you talked about gender in this episode super transphobic. Like, that is the sort of instinctive, like, we are both cis women, and so we are going to listen to trans listeners who are like, you didn't do a great job there. And we're going to be like, thank you and sorry, and here's how we'll do better next time. Versus, like, I got an email once from a guy who was like, you use witches as the general term for your listeners, like, hey, witches, how's it going? And that makes me as a man feel left out, and isn't the point of feminism that everybody should be included? And that was a very easy call of me being like, delete that email, don't care about that opinion at all. But there's going to be a gray zone as well. And I also think it's temperamental. I don't think it's talking out of school, telling tales out of school. I don't remember how any turns of phrase work today. To say that I think Marcel takes the critiques harder than I do. I think that she is more worried about hurting people than I am. That makes me sound like a monster. I'm also very worried about hurting people. I just think I have a little bit of a thicker skin than she does. But it was a learning process. And that's the world of critique from, like, listeners who care about helping you make your thing better and learning to get used to that vulnerability. It's even more, maybe not more complicated, but there's another set of concerns when it comes to the possibility of trolling, which, depending on the work that you're doing, podcasting can really amp up as well. So make a podcast about feminism. I say things that piss people off sometimes. A lot more people are likely to hear those things than are likely to read any of my articles or see any of my lectures, which means that I am more likely to get trolled or to get negative feedback from my podcasts. Podcasts are still a pretty rarely trolled medium. I often like to say that's because podcasts made by women have the greatest line of defense possible, which is that all of the ideas you say are hidden inside of a woman's voice. And if there's anything misogynists hate, it's listening to a woman talk. But in general, podcasts are just harder for somebody to set up a Google notification on words that make them mad, because they are less readily searchable. So it's less vulnerable, I think, than being somebody who writes publicly. For those reasons, you're likely to get a smaller audience who have opted in more fully to engaging with your work. But my podcasts have led to all of the situations in which I have gotten in serious trouble as a scholar. I'll just leave it at that. And I have gotten in some trouble because sometimes I say some shit. Martin asked, I feel like academic peer review is way harsher than iTunes review and less nerve-wracking than lecturing. You notice if students are bored during lectures, though. Ditto conference talks. Yeah, I mean, it's the really different modes of getting response from listeners and parsing the different kinds of feedback you get. That's part of why I really like the fact that Secret Feminist Agenda benefits both from listener feedback and from more traditional peer review, because the kinds of feedback that I get are really different. So iTunes reviews tend to be pretty nice. Most people who are going to bother leaving an iTunes review are probably going to do so because they like the thing you're making. On occasion, I think I have like one-star iTunes review for Secret Feminist Agenda because I made somebody mad on the episode where I said that the obesity epidemic is invented and just a symptom of cultural fat phobia. And that person got really upset about me for invalidating their weight loss journey, which I don't care about. So that's fine. Peer review looks at something in a more holistic way. And because the person has agreed to engage in the peer review before they have decided whether they like the thing or not, that's kind of part of the whole point, is that they agree, they sign on to review it not knowing in advance what they're going to think of it. And so you're more likely to get something that is neither like, this is trash, burn it to the ground, or this is the greatest thing I've ever heard and I want to marry this person, and something that's like a little bit more in between and a little bit more holistic, and a little bit more directed at helping you improve the thing. Which is why, even though I was a little skeptical about scholarly peer review on a podcast, I found it to be incredibly productive, because the kinds of high level response that I get about the podcast as a whole is not the kind of immersed in the thick of things response that you get from a listener who's more likely to be responding to a particular episode, a particular thing you said. That getting somebody to sort of look at the project as a whole gives you a really different perspective on it. And I, in fact, sort of feel like it's closer to the world of reviewing in general, right? Book reviewing, film reviewing, but there doesn't, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, the chat, but there doesn't seem to be a particularly robust world of podcast reviewing. There's podcast recommending, that's quite popular, where you'll get like a 2 or 3 sentence description of a podcast when it's included in a listicle, but the actual world of sort of robust cultural review and response, which in general is kind of dying out, reviewing as a medium is struggling to find a place outside of print publishing. But God, I'd love to see more thoughtful, engaged podcast reviews. It was a fun project. Somebody else start that, not me. How do you envision archiving this work, and what does having a digital repository for podcasts look like? Oh, how would you incorporate a DOI into your podcast? What a good question. I love that question. This is as exciting as when I was reading an article yesterday about the history of archiving spoken word performances, that was talking about how when the Pen Sound archive was first set up, MP3s were a proprietary file format, and so they were worried about using MP3s because they were worried that their rights to use the files were going to change in the future. Love the history of file formats. So I am just starting on a new 3-year research grant that is looking at expanding the world of scholarly podcasting in a variety of directions, including that we are acquiring some additional podcasts that will be part of a sort of nascent scholarly podcasting network that we're working on building. I need to be vague because we just got this grant and it's still under publication ban, so I can't give any details. But I will say a really big portion of the grant is dedicated to increasing the archiving and the discoverability of scholarly podcasts using some of the tools that we already have that have been built around digital archiving and digital discoverability. So particularly what we're looking at doing, I'm partnering with the digital humanities folks at my university here, and we're looking at sort of building an ingest tool, essentially, that will apply library standard metadata onto podcast episodes, that will deposit them into institutional repositories in order to make sure they're properly archived. and that will attach DOIs to them as part. And ideally, if we can make it work, also sort of automatically generate transcriptions in order to make sure that the podcasts are also properly accessible. But what we're really trying to do is to use DOIs and institutional repositories and metadata standards as different ways to incorporate podcasts into the discovery systems of scholarship, so that when somebody goes looking for a piece of scholarship on a particular topic, they might actually find a podcast in the same place that they would find a journal article. So that's going to be a lot of like metadata standard development and tool building and tool testing and stuff that is extremely exciting if you're interested in the long-term preservation of scholarly experiments, which we all are, obviously. How do you capture your audio, and do you find it has an effect on the topic you're discussing? Yeah, I had a really great conversation with somebody recently about the many, many different varieties of scholarly podcasts and the different ways that people think about what it means to make a podcast scholarly. And I was thinking about that as I was recently moving back and forth between working on two different podcasts I work on. So I make Secret Feminist Agenda. Secret Feminist Agenda is an interview podcast. I record it using the same tools I learned how to make Witch Please using. So I have a Zoom, and I now own two microphones, not to brag, but both my guest and me can hold our own microphones. But I have chosen technology for Secret Feminist Agenda that lends itself to intimacy wherever possible. I obviously have to do all of my interviews remotely right now, but my ideal in normal circumstances is to have guests over, to give them some food and wine if they drink it, and to sit on the couch and have a conversation with them. Because what I'm trying to do is create a conversation that feels warm and intimate and personal, and hope that that translates to listeners as well, and that the warmth and intimacy of the podcast, the sort of intentional casualness of it, translates in part as a way of making sometimes scholarly or challenging topics feel more accessible to listeners. The other podcast that I'm working on is the Spoken Web podcast, which is part of another big SSHRC grant. There's that key phrase again. That is about archiving recordings of, or digitizing archival recordings of Canadian literary events. So digitizing like poetry reading recordings from the 60s and 70s, for example. And we're making a podcast attached to that research project that is in part disseminating that archival audio. So there's a series of sort of short archival audio recordings that are released every second week by Catherine McLeod as part of her sort of curation of archival audio. And then the main episodes, which are released once a month, are sort of longer meditations on sound and poetry and audio recording and listening practices. And because that is a podcast that is about sound and technology and poetry and listening, and that is really engaged with these topics in a sort of richer and more deliberate way than Secret Feminist Agenda is, it's recorded in a totally different way. People record it for the most part alone, not in conversation, because they're really concerned with getting the best possible sound quality. Like that's the primary goal. And then a ton more of the work happens not in an in-person conversation, but after the fact via editing and production, because there's a lot of interest in layering of sound, layering together of voiceover and archival audio and music and sound effect, and trying to sort of build a soundscape that makes an argument. So it's a really different way of approaching what it means to make a scholarly podcast that is in part sort of produced by the very different technologies that are at work. Can you describe the peer review more? How is it different from fact checking? Yeah, absolutely. So peer review and fact checking, like they're not miles apart from each other in some ways. Some of the peer review that I have received in my life as a scholar has been very similar to fact checking. I'd say sort of fact checking falls into peer review, which is a larger set of concerns. So part of what peer review is doing is definitely making sure you're getting things right. So if you give a citation incorrectly, if you misrepresent what a particular text says, if you just give the wrong date for something, like peer review should be catching that stuff. But peer review is also, think about peer review as a combination of like fact checking, formative editing, and reviewing sort of all together at the same time. So somebody who's like checking if you've got things right, giving you ideas for how to make the thing better in light of what you're attempting to do, and then also giving a holistic evaluation of the qualities of the thing based on a sort of understanding of the larger field in which it falls. And that's best case scenario peer reviewing, because peer review is done by your peers, and so it's as good as your peers are, or as good as your peer reviews are at peer reviewing. That was a bit of an Ouroboros of a sentence, but you know, it's going to be of varying quality, just like your scholarship will be of varying quality. But the Secret Feminist Agenda peer review, I think, is a really great example of what good engaged peer review can look like, because the peer reviewers all begin from a sort of wrapping their heads around what the project is trying to do and trying to meet the project on its own level, trying to say like, okay, I see what you're attempting to do here. Let me talk about that project and what I think its pros and cons are. And now let me try to talk about how successfully you're engaging in that project. And it's in that sense of like somebody sitting down, listening through to multiple episodes of your podcast, wrapping their head around what you are attempting to do, and then saying, here's where you're messing up, here's where you can do better, here's where you've really nailed it, this is what I think you're contributing, this is what I would like to see you add in the future. That's that kind of holistic evaluation that I think is a real joy and a gift when it's done well. And that often, because it is a lot of work and a lot of thinking, often a lot of us don't get that kind of response to most of our work. Usually we're not lucky enough to get that kind of feedback. So peer review well done is a real joy to receive. A lot of the time it's not well done. It makes you feel sad. Martin has made the very important point that as Apple makes podcasts more searchable, they're going to be more trollable, and that is 100% the case. I feel extremely, in general, pretty thumbs down about increasing the searchability of podcasts. I think it's mostly an attempt to increase the available data in order to find new ways to monetize podcasts. And I think more searchability is going to have negative impacts on more vulnerable podcasters. Though there will possibly also be an increase in the default accessibility of podcasts if sort of automated transcription starts to be a thing, and that would definitely be good, because the consistency of transcribing of podcasts right now is quite poor, just not consistent across the industry. Helen asks, how do you deal with it when, for example, the author of a popular series of books about which you make a podcast says something highly problematic? That's never happened to me, so I don't know how to. I was about to say I'm lucky, but luck's not quite the word for it. It is a good thing that when Marcel and I started making Witch Please, we started right from the beginning from the premise that this was a series that we loved and that we were going to critique extensively. And it's impossible not to, because the first Harry Potter book the first Harry Potter book starts with a ton of fat phobia and then transfers pretty quickly into some of the most overt textual anti-Semitism that you will read in contemporary literature. And so unless you are really not reading carefully, you're going to know that there's some problems with these books pretty early on. And so really early on, we sort of positioned what we were doing as a like, we are fans of this series. We love this series in a lot of ways. We also think this series is real trash in a lot of ways. And so we're also going to have to talk about that. It's a beautiful thing about feminist critique is that even when you love a thing, you know that it has problems, and you know that you, in part, express your love for that thing by engaging richly and fully with its problems. And so when J.K. Rowling really demonstrates that subtextual trashness in a more textual way on Twitter, we are more prepared to be like, okay, remember how we pointed out that like there's something kind of inherently gender conservative about the magical enforcing of gendered dorms at Hogwarts? Well, here's some bad takes that J.K. Rowling has about gender. Would you look at that? Actually, it's a significantly less high-profile case, but the most trouble I have ever gotten into as a podcaster is critiquing Margaret Atwood on Secret Feminist Agenda. And I got in a lot of flack for that because I called her a shitty white woman. And people were very upset with me. And they were upset with me on a scale that normally they wouldn't have been, because the podcast reached a number of people it normally wouldn't have, and was easy to recirculate and was easy to quote out of context. And it was a good example of the way that public scholarship, especially public scholarship through a medium like podcasting, can get away from you sometimes. And you sort of say a thing thinking like, oh, you know, a few people will listen to this and get a lull. And then all of a sudden it's like being covered in a newspaper. And you're like, haha, whoops. Being public is bad sometimes, I guess. And was another case of me having to decide, you know, how I was going to respond to listener feedback, and whether I was going to listen to the people who said that they were glad I had said that, or the people who were mad. I usually don't listen to the people who want me to shut up because I'm being mean. Like, that's usually not the feedback I'm responding to, just as a general default. Yeah, big sips of water. Yeah, this is a great question. And okay, I think this will be the last question that I tackle because we are an hour in. Thank you, Brenda. But this question is from Jess. You mentioned considerations of structure when starting out. Can you expand on that in relation to developing a scholarly podcast? So I mentioned right at the beginning that one of the reasons I think Witch Please was successful to start is that Marcel made a point of building structure in. And what I think is really important is that she built for us a kind of infrastructure or frame through which and around which we could improvise. And what I feel is more common in scholarly podcasts is, in fact, a tendency towards too much structure rather than not enough. So a tendency to reproduce the scholarly norms of communication via the lecture or via the conference paper, possibly via a webinar. Still not clear on what a webinar is. I've never gone to one, but they sound bad. And so what you get in the podcast is somebody talking for 20 minutes or an hour like this, right? So boring. Sorry. And what we did with Witch Please was create regular segments that we were going to tackle every episode and that we're going to structure our conversation. And then within that segment, like, okay, here's the part where we talk about Hermione. And then within that segment, we just talked to each other. And we had done our homework. So we would read the books, we would mark up all the stuff we thought was interesting. We would sit down at the beginning and figure out which conversations we wanted to have in which segment. But we would just have these really rough notes, and then we would sit down and just start to talk. And the fact that we thought of the podcast as a conversation between the two of us to begin with, rather than thinking of it as a lecture or a paper or a talk, really helped to break us out of those conventions of scholarly communication, which can be so stilted and uncomfortable to listen to and dry, and really shifted us into like some of the best forms of scholarly conversation, like maybe the really good grad seminar that you're in with like people who really push you and expand your thinking, or like even better, the bar at the end of the day after a really interesting panel where you sit down with colleagues and have a couple of drinks and like talk about the stuff that you just heard, and like usually sort of like propose 17 new collaborative projects that you're never going to actually do, but you're like so excited about all the ideas you just encountered, you just want to like think about stuff you could do with them. And those are the kinds of modes that we were interested in reproducing, the kinds of feelings of conviviality and congeniality that can come through in conversations that are sort of centered around a particular set of texts or questions. And I really do believe that it is the sort of creation of structure up front that gave us space to improvise and to sort of more casually set a dialogue to start with. And that's something that I've tried to carry through in some ways in Secret Feminist Agenda, though it is a less structured podcast than Witch Please is. But then compare that to Spoken Web, which is a significantly more structured podcast because they are all trying to do different things. And so figuring out at the beginning, like, what am I trying to do here? Who am I trying to reach? What are some podcasts that I think do that well? What structures do they have? How can I mimic those? Are all really, really good questions to ask up front. But if there's any question I would like academics to ask up front when they're starting to make podcasts, it's how can I avoid just reproducing the driest parts of scholarly communication, right? If you're going to learn about how to podcast effectively, learn from podcasters. Go listen to good podcasts that are communicating complex ideas in interesting ways, and look at how they do it. And then think, how can I adopt structures like that and tell the story of my own research within those structures? Okay. Thank you all so much for those delightful questions and for hanging out with me while I talked about podcasting and scholarship. I hope there was something useful in there. And you're all great. That was it. Do I just turn it off now, or do I just sit here staring at the screen for a while? I'm really good at breaking feeds. Yeah, thank you. Oh, Matthew was here the whole time. Hey, congratulations on the postdoc. Wait, how am I commenting on my own feed? That's amazing. Okay. I'm gonna exit purse first. Bye, everyone.